When I was first asked about document accessibility, my natural reaction, well, what does that mean? And the person I was speaking with said, well, here's what it means, Shannon. Unplug your mouse, unplug your monitor. Now read your bank statement.
Jonathan Hassell interviews Shannon Kelly on Scalable PDF accessibility. Today I have Shannon Kelly with me, an accessibility expert with a focus on PDF documents. So thanks for taking the time to chat with me today, Shannon.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan.
The reason I wanted to interview you for the book was that when we were chatting a week or so ago and you were telling me the story of how you got to where you are today, that story touched on most of the challenges that I believe organizations face in document accessibility. So I thought it would be great to share that story with my readers and my viewers. So shall we start out at the very beginning? I'm interested in how you first became aware of the importance of making documents accessible to disabled people.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I found myself in a position working with an organization that was a provider to federal government for digital services. There was some legislation that came about in the U.S. back in the early 2000s around Section 508, and the organization was asked if we could make those documents that we were doing digital services for accessible to meet the compliance standards. At that time, I was completely unfamiliar with document accessibility and what that meant. That was around 2001, 2002. So through that evolution, very quickly learned about PDF accessibility. At that time, there were no real standards, so to speak. There was some ambiguous interpretations of some of the legislation that had just been adopted. So what I found myself doing was learning very, very quickly how to interpret some of those standards into practical application. So the first thing that I did was I went out and brought in teams of individuals who were non-sighted people. And I worked with several of the local organizations and several of the lighthouses. And I brought in non-sighted people who were essentially real users of the assistive technologies like screen readers that allow people who are not sighted to read, consume, and navigate documents. And learning how the tag structure underneath of a PDF that's not visible to the naked eye is only really visible to this software that these individuals use. When I was first asked about document accessibility, my natural reaction, well, what does that mean? And the person I was speaking with said, well, here's what it means, Shannon. Unplug your mouse, unplug your monitor, now read your bank statement. And that was essentially the real click that happened in my head. And I realized, what am I left with? I'm left with a processor and a keyboard. So understanding now that these documents needed to be structured in a way that an individual could access that information and have it read back to them and navigate through it using just their keyboard.
It's interesting you talked about bank statements there because obviously that's one of the main sort of sources of PDFs out there. You know, people are using PDFs because these are documents that are incredibly secure, that they have to, that they come out of processes that create all of those documents. Because a number of people kind of say, well, why not just use an HTML page? Why do you need PDF?
I'm asked that question probably on a weekly, if not daily basis. So, when you talk about security of bank statements, the reality is a person using a screen reader needs access to that information because they too want to make decisions about finances and the market and investments. And to address the HTML, XML question, most of your portals into a bank are going to be designed in that fashion, which is great for your summary information. But if you're going to go get a mortgage or buy a car or make a major purchase, oftentimes you've got to provide some resources that say, yeah, I'm financially capable of taking on that loan, which means they want to see your bank statements. If you have tax issues or you want reimbursement for expenses, you have to provide that documentation. Those are the PDFs. You make a great point, Jonathan. I was really delighted to hear you say that, because many people don't understand that inside of a bank, there's massive investment in their infrastructure. They have a lot of data that they pull from a lot of sources, and it all converges together into sort of a template. That's what we know as our statement. So if you and I had an account at the same bank, our statements may look identical in structure, but they're going to have your name versus my name versus your account number and your balance, which obviously is going to be much higher than my balance on the bank statement. So we have all of that data.
Sure.
That data all converges together into oftentimes a print file, and that print file is what goes off to the printer, so they print the statements that come in the mail. Those print files then take on a whole different path. If there's alternate formats that are needed or requested, like Braille and large print is really growing, particularly with our aging population, that print file goes out to the printers who are able to produce Braille. That print file also gets converted into a PDF, which is what gets posted on the internet.
Sure.
So you log on to your bank statement and you find your PDF when you put your password in and so forth. So now we have hundreds of millions, if not billions, of pages of PDF bank statements that are created every month that are not accessible. And the reason they're not accessible is one of the reasons why I'm in the industry that I am now. There's really only one approach previously to making documents accessible, and that was the space I was in, and that's manually manipulating the documents. That industry needed a very different approach because the manual process simply would not scale for all of those pages. It's a pretty time and labor intensive process to manually tag those documents.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, one of the things that I guess people who don't know about this would say is, well, why doesn't the mechanisms that they use to create those documents, why doesn't that do the tagging itself anyway? It kind of feels like, if I'm understanding you correct, that you have a process to create these PDFs, but it doesn't have everything that the PDFs need to be accessible. So then you send it over to a team of people who then take the document and, if you like, reassemble it, add the stuff to it that should have been there in the first place. Am I getting that right?
You're exactly right. I used to run a team of people, and depending on the size of the contract we'd have with the federal government, I could have anywhere from 75 to 100 operators sitting in a large room, in cubicles, doing nothing but manually manipulating the tags on these documents.
Right.
And those documents numbered in the millions of pages. An average page could take as little as 10 minutes, as much as 8 to 10 hours per page, depending on how complex that document is. So now you can certainly see that there's a threshold of how many documents an organization could possibly manipulate and remediate, right? So what happens is the institutions, governments, banks, what have you, previously they didn't have a way to make all of those documents automatically accessible, because even though technology existed for several years that would allow you to add tags to the document automatically, the tags aren't properly ordered in a way that allows somebody that's using the screen reader to navigate. So there may be tags there, but people using screen readers like JAWS, Windows Eyes, NVDA, they're using shortcut commands and hotkeys, right, to read a document audibly the same way sighted people read it visually. So when you look at a document, you don't normally start in the upper left-hand corner and read natively left to right, top to bottom. That's how the screen reader would read if you just press the go button on it and let it go. But we wouldn't pick up a bank statement or a newspaper and read it that way. You would be reading the first sentence of each column. If there's 3 columns on the document, it's just not comprehensible. So what was missing in the automated tagging process is navigability. So when you look at a document, you may want to look at all of the headings first and kind of get a feel for the landscape of the document, and then maybe read the paragraphs under that heading. Well, a blind person using their screen reader may want to read the same way. So they're going to use shortcut keys, and they're going to look for headings and find what they're interested in and drill down into it. And then think of tables and how complex it is if you're looking at it as a sighted person. Sometimes we can't make heads or tails out of it. Now imagine what that's like trying to navigate a table. So properly structuring those tags was really the issue. So what ended up happening is organizations would simply pull out the documents only if somebody asked for one in an accessible format, because they didn't have a way to make all of them accessible. They'd have no profit left, right? Because it's a very time-consuming and expensive process.
I'll just give you one case of one of my clients a couple of years ago, where they said that they'd spent, I think, something like £3,000 because somebody with a particular disability had said that they needed, I think it was in the annual report of the company, in a different alternative format. And it was one of those things where they had to kind of completely redo everything for that one person. And I said to them, that's crazy. It's unreasonable for you to have to spend that amount of money for one person to get them the right information. It would almost be better for them to say, for you to pay somebody to go and read it to them. That would be kind of cheaper almost. And the problem with it all is that because they weren't making the documents accessible per se, just as a business as usual process, somebody was actually having to say, I want that document. Your current one isn't good enough for me. I need something different. So they were having to, if you like, disclose their disability to get the information they were after.
Yeah.
Presumably that kind of fits into your whole equation of this. It just doesn't feel like this is working at this step. In this part of your story, what I'm hearing is disabled people are having to sort of, if you like, fight for their rights for the information they need.
Absolutely. And I would hate to be the person, and I've heard a very similar example before about why don't we just pay someone to read the document out loud to the person who needs the document who can't read it. And I've often thought to myself, boy, I'd hate to be the person that has to read that document, because every time I read a PDF, reading it one time visually doesn't mean I automatically remember everything. I often have to go back and reference that document multiple times. Now all of a sudden we've got somebody coming over to your house 3, 4, half a dozen times because you can't remember what they read to you. So that certainly is not scalable either, right?
And presumably this is also the stuff that's in PDFs is really private information.
Absolutely, absolutely. And nobody wants to have someone look at the bank statement. I mean, most of us don't want our spouse to see what's in our bank statement, let alone a complete stranger who now is going to, perhaps pass. It's private. You're exactly right. So the self-identification was really a big concern for me. The difference, I am a proponent of inclusionary accessibility, not an accommodation. And here's where I've drawn the line in terms of technology and accessibility. We are forcing our customers, whatever business you're forcing your customers to go to the website and self-engage and service their own needs there. It's cheaper for an organization. They don't have to staff the call centers, right? So the individuals, whether you're sighted or not, you go to the website. If you're not sighted, you're utilizing digital tools, assistive technologies to access the web. But now all of a sudden, you have to raise your hand and say, oh, by the way, yeah, I'm using assistive technology to get through your web, but I need you to make your PDF accessible too. Many organizations say, we don't know how to do that. We have Braille. We'll give you Braille. And even if they're producing Braille, oftentimes it takes some time. So you don't get your statement or document at the same time everyone else gets it. So having to raise your hand was a real issue for me, because my perspective is, if you're providing Braille or large print, that's, in my opinion, an accommodation, because it's a traditional format that you're not providing inherently anyway.
Sure.
However, a PDF document's a whole different story. If you're providing a PDF document for everyone, they should be accessible PDFs. So I don't view a PDF as an accommodation. I believe that all PDFs created should be created accessibly. They can be, and there's now technology to allow for that, so that no matter whether you have a disability or no disability, the PDF looks the same to everyone. The only difference is there's tags that are embedded in it that are properly tagged to meet certain formats and compliance standards that are barrier-free PDFs. So I'm a big proponent of providing the accessibility within the enterprise versus at the desktop.
Sure.
And so that would eliminate individuals from having to raise their hand. You may be a Braille reader, and Braille is not going to go away. We still need Braille for, reference, certain tactile references. But from accessibility, it's just a different perspective today.
Yeah. So there's the ideal. That's where we want to get, and that's. But if we're going back into that room where you have hundreds of people manually tagging documents, that's just not going to work, is it? That's just not scalable. If those documents are sort of company reports that come out annually, then you can cope with it. But if these are individual personalized statements that go out every month, then you're not going to be able to afford to actually service those disabled customers in that way. It just doesn't feel, as I say, I'm all about the business case. I'm all about what's reasonable. And so far, this isn't feeling reasonable to me. So that must have occurred to you as well.
Sure did.
So you've got a problem there. How did you go about trying to fix it?
Well, it's funny because the organization that I was working with put me in a position where I was always looking for different tools. And I was always looking for a way. In fact, I had given consideration to hiring developers to develop some algorithms that could assist with speeding up that process for that exact reason. So you're right. If you're creating a document at the desktop level in, a Microsoft Office or an Adobe Suite product, and if you create that document one time and you're able to use it to service many individuals, you can cope with manually tagging that document. But you're exactly right. Now you've got a document that's created one time that has your personal information in it. It only serves one person. And if you're an organization, bank statements is an easy reference because most of us have bank accounts. If you have 1 million customers, if you're a major bank with 1 million customers, even if only 1% of them, which is a very conservative number, had a visual disability, start doing the math, times the average number of pages of a bank statement, which is 4, you're looking at 40,000 pages every 28 days for that billing cycle. So it simply doesn't scale. You're absolutely right. And along the line, something very strange happened to me personally in about the mid-2000s. I've had a lot of eye issues most of my life. In fact, since the late 80s, I've been blind in one eye. So in my seeing eye, I had pretty good vision. And some interesting things happened. I ended up getting a very terrible infection in my eye and was scheduled to have my only seeing eye removed. Right. And during the course of many, many surgeries and reconstructive surgeries, I had to become able to use the same screen reader technologies that I had been advocating for this other community that now all of a sudden I find myself a part of. As a result, I also was diagnosed in 2010 with multiple sclerosis, and have since then found that my eye doesn't receive the image as fast as somebody else's eye because I've got a lot of damage to the optic nerve. Okay. So now what happens is, because of the infection, I learned how to use the assistive technology. About 5 years later, I've become dependent on it. Right. So I'm still a sighted person, but I can't read anything beyond maybe 2 pages, 3 pages maximum, because my eye just tires out and those images just aren't received very well. So now all of a sudden, I really have a business challenge to solve as well as a personal challenge. So one of the things that I was looking for is, how in the world can we automate this? And I came across an organization who was advertising that they had a technology solution that would address the issue. Okay. At the time, I didn't believe it. I invited that organization in, I looked at the technology, and my first thought was, wow, this stuff really does work. And I looked at that technology, and immediately I wanted to put that technology in a data center and host it out as a service, kind of break it up for federal government and banks and so on. So as I looked at that technology from a customer or partner perspective, along the way, I ended up going to work for that company. So now I have kind of a first-hand look, using a customer's perspective at what this technology is able to do, because that's the gap that technology solves in the marketplace, is that scalability.
And I guess it's scalability, it's consistency. You can put in place a process. A lot of what I'm doing in BS 8878 is to put in place a process to enable organizations to just this be the way they work. But in this particular example, the process is just going to be incredibly costly to put out there. You've now got some means of automating that process, so it just becomes, just easier to do, cheaper to do. So the solution that you have, can you just take us through it a little?
Yeah, it's actually quite simple. As I said earlier, there's a lot of automation tools that will allow tags to be applied to a PDF, but just not necessarily the right tags or in the right order. And that was the real issue. No matter what solution you look at, it requires a human to be involved in the process. Even though we have a multitude of compliance standards, you mentioned in the BS 8878, we have a PDF UA format, and there are some standards associated with that. There are separate standards associated with the U.S., Section 508, or the ADA, the Rehabilitation Act. There's a host of them. And then we also have the WCAG or WCAG 2.0 now. The challenge is that a standard is just that. It's a standard. But when it comes to usability, you've got to apply common sense. You just have to. And that's where a human has to be involved, no matter whether you're doing it manually or you're looking at an automated solution. So with the solution that's available today, you essentially build a template for your structured data, and a human builds that template. And you apply the accessibility rules to the template. So now a human can actually input how a document should be read in what order, and how the elements on a page should react for navigation, working with those screen readers. So we still have a human involved so that we've got good common sense. Once we create that template, the data that flows through that template absorbs those accessibility rules, so everything that spits out the other end becomes a properly tagged, standards compliant to the WCAG standards 2.0 at a level AA accessibility. So it's interesting because you can flow any kind of an input through the solution. Some organizations want to move their print file directly through those templates. Some already have the PDFs made and they want those PDFs through the template. But again, these are really structured data like the notices, tax communications, bank statements, where you've got really high volumes, very similar structure, but individualized personal data on them. And those templates are set. It happens in the enterprise. So it doesn't require operators at a desktop to be manually touching things up. You create one template, all the data that flows through that template comes out perfectly accessible on the other end.
That sounds like mail merge to me. It sounds like, in some ways, it just sounds like the obvious right way of doing things, in that you separate the information that stays static from the information that needs to change, and you find a way of setting rules so that it all comes together in the right sort of way. Am I getting you right?
Yeah, you are. And it's actually a really intelligent tool because it was patented technology that's been around for 30 years. This is not brand new technology. Very strong, rich history of a solution that is a transformation product. Back earlier, I mentioned taking print files and converting those to PDFs when the internet first came about. That technology is what we built on. It was a natural evolution since we had major corporations, major banks, major government agencies that were transforming their print files into PDF. Well, why couldn't we just make them accessible PDFs? And that's essentially what happened. So we are absolutely getting closer to the evolution of what I'm a proponent of, is an inclusionary world where you're designing your documents accessibly from the get-go. And it's exactly what people should be doing. The hard part is helping people understand that the technology even exists today, but it's definitely out there, and it works exceptionally well.
It's now your job to go out there and to do that, to evangelize this, to talk. Whereabouts are you at the moment?
I had to look out the window. I am in Washington, D.C. today.
You're in Washington, D.C.
Last week I was in Toronto, Canada when we spoke, and the week before that I was in Michigan.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking I may be attending the RNIB's conference in September in Glasgow, so maybe we'll have a chance to get together then.
That would be good. So, I mean, you're going all the way around the world talking about the need for accessible PDFs and talking about the technology that you have. What sort of reception are you getting? Are there differences between different countries? I know there's certainly differences in the law, but are there differences in how people respond to what you're asking them to do?
Yeah, certainly. In the U.S., there's a very interesting dynamic between private sector and public sector. In the U.S., there are two legislations. One is the American with Disabilities Act, and the other is the Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. That I talked about, which is a mandate for federal government, but because it's the largest consumer of electronic, ICT, it forced those requirements out into the private market. So the U.S. is quite litigious, and what we see here is in the private sector, organizations are not as they don't seem to be as aggressively seeking an answer until they're forced to do so.
Sure.
So what's happening is we see organizations in the U.S. who are getting sued, quite a few of them, a good number of them, but that's a separate story. But as organizations are getting sued, now suddenly they're coming to us asking for that solution for their PDFs. On the government side, the governments have a mandate. They are mandated to do this, and they are aggressively looking at us asking us for the solution. So we have a lot more traction within U.S. government than in private sector in the U.S. In other parts of the country, particularly in Canada, which not necessarily as litigious as the U.S., but there is one iconic lawsuit there. They have the, in Ontario now, there's the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. So that is driving, again, compliance with those accessibility guidelines because they're being audited and they need to meet compliance. When we get over into Europe, and that's more of your neck of the woods, the culture is a little bit different. It's certainly less litigious. We see that organizations in the private sector, we would like to see them move towards compliance with these standards because it's the right thing to do, but more so because the community of individuals with disabilities have enormous buying power. And we see organizations spending tons of money to market to certain segments, maybe multilingual segments, et cetera, to try to increase revenue. The buying power that individuals with disabilities have and those who are visually impaired is a market that can be marketed to if you make your content accessible for them as well. So we see these standards, we see different levels of acceptance and adoption throughout the world, but the common line that I see is everywhere that I go, I see movement toward accessibility, which is a good thing.
Which is a good thing. So, so just one final question. Is there one opportunity or threat to the accessibility of web content for people with disabilities that you think will be sort of most important in the future?
Well, it's interesting. We've been talking a lot about PDF, and we know PDF is not going to go away. As you mentioned, many organizations are regulated to have a PDF format as their official record of archive, right? So we know that's not going away, but at the same time, mobile devices are becoming incredibly more popular today, and we see a greater number of individuals looking to interact with their mobile devices. In terms of opportunity for organizations, it is to create accessible content that can be delivered through those mobile devices. In terms of the threat, that's an interesting question. I look at the different formats that are available, and if we look at our aging population today, the individuals who are aging, that number is growing rapidly as the baby boomers are aging. We see an increased demand for large print on paper. But we also know that those same individuals utilize technology. So if we look at our parents today who may be in their 60s or 70s or maybe their 80s, in the 60s and 70s range, many of those individuals are interacting with the internet and the web. However, we have macular degeneration, we have the natural aging process where we start to lose our vision. So making the content on your website so that it can still be accessible even to people with low vision is certainly something that we want to move toward as well. And when we look at the technology for documents that allows for things like reflow, so that those documents can be read properly with the screen readers, that same technology applies to stuff on the screen when we start to look at reflow for larger prints and bigger sizes.
Absolutely.
So those are the things that I think organizations really want to take in perspective.
Hey, that's great. Well, thank you so much for your time. That's been really, really useful, and so thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan.
This interview is one of 16 filmed to contribute to my book, Including Your Missing 20% by Embedding Web and Mobile Accessibility. The book provides a full guide on how to transform your organisation to achieve the consistent creation of websites and mobile apps that are usable and accessible to all your customers at the most efficient cost. Find out more about the book by visiting hasselinclusion.com/book. Did you like this video? If so, why not share it with your friends? And I've got many more videos on their way with other accessibility experts from all over the world, so make sure you don't miss them by subscribing to my channel. Thanks so much for watching.